Seeking Level, Chapter 4. He waited for an answer, but none came. He looked up at the unrelenting walls of the canyon to see if there were any way to climb up to higher ground. There wasn't. He looked down their never-ending path to see if there was any change ahead. Nothing. The only change he could make out was the sun. They were running out of daylight. Soon it would be dark and cold again. Keith coughed against his arm, spit out what he could, and resolutely started walking back to Lance, who was still huddled on the ground on all fours. "I think it's done," Lance said, hearing Keith's footsteps as he came to a stop beside him. Keith went down on one knee, putting one hand on Lance's shoulder and bending down to check on the bleeding. It did seem to have stopped, but judging from the mess on the ground, it had taken a while. "Blood all over my face now?" "Not really," Keith said, checking that over too. "Just a bit." The way that Lance had tried to wipe it off at first had now given him a rather savage look, like he'd been eating raw meat or something. But it was just going to have to stay that way. "I didn't know you were so squeamish," Lance accused, trying to smile, but being too tired to complete the effort, mistaking completely the reason Keith had needed to walk away from him. "There's a lot you don't know about me," Keith said, then regretted it. He didn't want to tell Lance the real reason he'd had to walk away was because he was afraid of Lance dying in those moments. He hadn't thought long on it when Alora mentioned it as a possibility, but if he'd given it more than a second this morning, he would have thought himself completely capable of sitting next to Lance for his final moments. He'd thought he would be strong enough to be there for him, as Alora had said. Now that it was becoming more and more of a possibility, it was also becoming clear that watching Lance die, holding his hand while it happened, was not something he was strong enough for. "I got time," Lance invited, but Keith was already shaking his head. "Nuh-uh." He voiced his opposition to opening up about himself, shaking his head against the dark thoughts he'd allowed to take root there about how much time Lance might have left. "You first." "Maybe we should just get going," Lance sighed, but Keith couldn't tell exactly why. "Come on, then," he said, putting his hands under Lance's arms and gathering his strength into his knees for another lift. "Up you get." They stood. Keith caught Lance as he buckled, then quickly used his thumbs to dash away 2 tears that dripped from his sightless eyes, watching him biting his lip in annoyance and pain. "You're doing great," Keith said, wishing he sounded more genuine. He did mean it. Lance bit his lips harder as they trembled, and he nodded weakly, leaving his head hanging after he'd finished. "Take a step." The sun moved over them, and the shadows followed. The air chilled, as it had the previous evening. Keith pondered the idea of stopping for the night, finding somewhere to wait out the cold. It was getting harder to move, harder to see the rocks they were walking over. Lance plodded along as well as ever, but Keith struggled to guide him. As darkness fell, he stepped wrong off a larger rock, wrenching his ankle and pulling Lance down on top of him as he faltered to his right. He ended up getting Lance's knee pounded on his hip, and they knocked heads. That didn't matter much to Keith, who was wearing the helmet, but Lance cried out and curled up instantly. "Sorry," Keith apologized, as if that would help, putting one hand on Lance's shoulder and the other on his head. Lance cradled his injured skull in both hands, writhing. "You okay?" "Just get off," Lance wailed, and Keith obeyed, stands writhing. "You okay?" "Just get off," Lance wailed, and Keith obeyed, standing up and pacing in a protective circle around Lance to work off his worried energy. For a couple scary seconds, the writhing looked like it was working its way into a complete seizure, but in the end Lance calmed down and held completely still, lying on his side. "Better?" Keith asked, concerned, guilty, still walking around his teammate. "It's cold," Lance noticed, now that he was still, ignoring the question. "Sun's going down," Keith told him. "It's getting hard to see." "Tell me about it," Lance replied, surprisingly bitter. "I'm sorry," Keith repeated, forcing himself to stop pacing. "Maybe we should stop?" Lance asked, hopeful, unmoving. "Rest somewhere until morning?" "We could," Keith began, hesitant. There were many reasons he didn't want to do that. Keith joined Lance on the ground, putting a hand on his knee. "I'm worried if I let you go to sleep that you'll lose your memory again," Keith told him honestly. "I don't want to have to explain to you why it's so dark when it's not. I've done it twice now, and that's more than enough." And a part of him was honestly afraid that if Lance slept, he might not wake up at all. Lance sighed, all exhausted hopelessness. "Should we keep going, then?" he asked, depending on Keith to make the right decision. "Let's try a little longer," Keith suggested, getting under Lance's arm to help him upright. His back protested the motion almost as completely as Lance's knees, but eventually they made it, as they always did. Except this time when Keith pulled Lance forward for that first step after a rest, he didn't take it. His foot sort of dragged, and then Keith had to move in close to catch him before he fell on his face. "Easy," he said, his worry meter wrenching to unbearable again. What was that? "I don't know," Lance said tiredly. "I thought I was moving." "Try again," Keith commanded, giving the familiar tug and stepping backward. Lance stepped forward using his other leg, but the right one buckled again under him as he rested his weight on it. "What's going on? What's up with your leg?" That's when Keith noticed that Lance's right hand was not gripping his wrist as tightly as the left one. "And your hand? Lance, squeeze my arm, okay? Tight as you can. Both hands." The muscles of Lance's left arm flexed as he put more pressure onto Keith's forearm, but the right barely moved. "I said both hands," Keith repeated, slightly shaking his left arm to make his point, hearing Allura in his memory saying that this might happen, that Lance may lose function in some of his limbs. "I am," Lance replied, the effort he was making evident in his voice, his fingers curled uselessly around Keith. "No," Keith whispered in protest, his fingers curled uselessly around Keith. "No," Keith whispered in protest. He knew. Of course, he'd known for a while now that the pressure in Lance's head was getting worse. The dizziness, the nosebleed, all of it. But he'd kept him going because there was just nothing else to be done. But now, his whole right side was almost paralyzed after that last fall. Something had broken after they'd clashed heads. "That's it, then," Lance said, defeated, bowing over their hands, Keith supporting his entire weight. "No," Keith repeated louder. "You're not giving up yet." "It's okay," Lance comforted, resigned. Just go on ahead without me." "Absolutely not!" Keith snapped, denial hot in his veins at the suggestion. "No!" "I can't do it anymore, Keith," Lance said matter-of-factly. "I'm too tired." "Then we'll rest," Keith "It's not just that," Lance maintained, and Keith shook his head as if he could stop himself hearing it. "You need to leave me." Keith put his hands on either side of Lance's head, staring him in the face as if he could see him. "I am not doing that," he said firmly. "The team needs you," Lance went on. "I don't want to be responsible for both of us dying down here." "No one's dying down here!" Keith shouted, making Lance wince. He coughed, removing his hands from Lance's face as it doubled him over, his lungs and throat burning with the ache of it. "You're getting worse," Lance said over his hacking. "You need help, Keith, and you can get to it so much faster if you leave me here. You need to go." "Not without you," Keith repeated when he could talk again. "You're a paladin of Voltron every bit as much as I am." "Am I?" Lance echoed, his voice full of self-doubt. I've lost Blue. Maybe the reason I can't feel her anymore is because she knows I can't pilot her like this. I can't see. I can't feel my whole right side. You'll have to find a new paladin. Someone better." "Shut up," Keith said harshly. Lance nodded, biting his lips together. Keith bit his lips too, rage increasing the pain that was already in his chest. He didn't understand how Lance could say that kind of crap. "Don't talk like that." Lance curled into himself tightly, folding his arms and pulling his knees up. It looked unnatural and unsettling. Lance normally sprawled wherever he rested. Keith felt his throat close up, watching him. He heard himself make a frustrated growling noise, and then he was moving. The same sort of energy that forced him to pace earlier was now carrying him down the trail from where Lance had given up. As he walked, he scanned the canyon walls, removing his helmet, looking for anything that might help them, for any way he could get Lance out of here. But even if he did, then what? What would be better up there on the surface than where they were already? The castle was still gone. The healing pod that Lance needed was still out of range. There really was nothing here. They were out of options, beyond hope. Keith paused in the shadows, ran both of his hands through his hair, not ready to accept that there really was nothing to be done, but not coming up with any ideas either. When his boots stopped scuffing along the gravel, he picked up on a weird sound behind him. He turned toward it, knowing it was a sound Lance was making, but it was so odd that he stood there for a few moments trying to make it register as a human noise. It wasn't crying, really, or maybe it was. Something stifled and hopeless, a sound on the brink of torture. It was fast and agonal. Not words, just pain. A lonely sound that pricked into Keith's mind, made the hair on his arms stand on end. People shouldn't make sounds like that. Keith wanted it to stop. "Lance, hey," he started as he returned, ready to do anything if Lance would just not make that sound anymore. But Lance had heard him coming and was trying to get a handle on himself. He scrubbed his arm across his face, breathing fast and shallow, resting on his hands and knees as he struggled to get himself upright without much control of his right side. He couldn't quite manage it. His shattered balance, fatigue, and weakness kept tipping him to the side, landing him hard on his shoulder and hip. There was fresh blood on his upper lip from his nose. Keith placed firm hands on his shoulders to still him, hating that there was nothing he could do to help him, frustrated at the damage he was seeing, at what Lance had become. "Just hold still, all right? You're gonna hurt yourself." Or maybe that this was who Lance was in secret, when no one was with him. "Keith," Lance breathed, sounding oddly relieved, sounding like a person again, instead of whatever animal had been possessing him a minute ago. "I thought you left me." Keith didn't think he could hurt any more than he already was, but this accusation stung him deep. He'd just finished telling Lance that he wasn't going to desert him. How could he doubt it so quickly? "Don't be stupid," Keith admonished fiercely. "I already told you I'm not doing that. And if you didn't want me to, then why tell me to go?" Keith began tugging on Lance as he spoke, not to get him to his feet this time, just to pull him over to the curve of the canyon wall so they could rest against it. They were in for a long, cold night. Might as well try to find somewhere as comfortable as possible. "Because it's the best plan," Lance mumbled as they "Sound like you actually believe that," Keith replied, surprised. Where was the Lance who thought they were rivals? The Lance who stated simply but loudly that he was a ninja, that he was cool. Where was that guy? That annoying, persistent psycho. And why did Keith suddenly miss him? Lance didn't respond as Keith helped prop him up against the soft dirt at the base of the wall, not even questioning what they were doing or why Keith was pushing him into position against the soil. The place where dust rolled down and settled, but did not pack. Keith thought about digging it out a bit, making a little foxhole for them to try and preserve some warmth, but remembered the last time he'd disturbed the delicate balance of the canyon and changed his mind. He allowed himself to drop next to his teammate, and then allowed himself to unashamedly stare at him. It wasn't like he would know. He kept his eyes closed, his body still curled, the blood on his face flaking off in places. There was a paleness under the natural tone of his skin that gave him a ghostly, unhealthy, and unsettling appearance in the dark. There were bruises under his eyes. "Lance?" Keith asked, disturbed at Lance's stillness, how he looked so close to death. "Stay awake." "Okay," Lance acquiesced sleepily, shifting closer to Keith without realizing it. "Lance, I'm serious," Keith returned, though he could feel it too. Now that they weren't moving, just as before, his body felt weighted. He rested his aching head against the soil of the canyon, breathing in the earthy smell of it, so familiar. "Stay with me." He reached over to shake Lance's shoulder, which caused him to startle, then groan. "Don't," Lance slurred. "Hurts." "I know, but I need you to stay awake." "I am." But he wasn't. He was slipping away, and for a second Keith understood how Lance could make that horrible sound. The thought of him sleeping, of never waking, gripped Keith's heart tight with ineffable fear and desperation. He didn't want Lance to leave him. "Come on, sit up." Keith grabbed Lance's wrists and pulled him upright until they were both sitting next to each other in the cold, unwilling to let him go. Lance clumsily folded his arms around his knees, then leaned his head against Keith's shoulder. He tensed, but didn't move away. "We're getting out of here," he promised, trying to fill the empty words with some kind of certainty. "It's cold," Lance said again, and Keith licked his lips, clearing his throat. He felt so trapped here, so helpless. He wanted to stand up, toss Lance over his shoulder, and keep on down the path. And at the same time, he wanted to lie down, curl up, and sleep. Lance brought his arm up so he could rest his palm against the back of his head, tucking his chin to his chest. Keith repeated, trying to pull the truth of it into existence with just words. "Just hang on." Lance's weight against him increased slowly as the darkness deepened. The chill set into Keith's muscles. Lance was already shivering. Keith leaned back as Lance leaned in, until somehow he sat reclined against the wall with Lance's head on his chest. He kept his teeth clenched to stop their chattering until his jaw ached and his head throbbed. At one point he noticed that when he coughed, Lance didn't move. He pulled his arm out from under him so he could shake him awake again, but this time Lance didn't respond. Keith held his breath, then let it out in relief when he'd confirmed that Lance was still breathing, too. Keith stared at the blackness high above him and started counting Lance's breaths. It was hard to tell whether Lance was sleeping and waking or if he slipped in and out of consciousness. At the same time, Keith couldn't tell if he was drifting off either. Sometimes Lance's right hand would spasm. Keith, cold and worried, shifted them around until he was sort of cradling his teammate, keeping a close eye on his face, gripping his right wrist tightly to keep it controlled. Every so often Lance would whimper and begin to struggle in Keith's arms, completely disoriented, so he'd tighten his hold, curling over Lance protectively. Each time Lance would cry for help in these moments, obviously waking with no idea where he was or what was going on, confused and hurting. "I've got you," Keith would assure him, turning his head when Lance's struggling would set off another nosebleed. "You're going to be all right." "Keith," Lance would question, at least at the beginning, "what happened?" "You've been hurt," Keith would answer gently, incessantly, repeating the same phrases over and over, sometimes every few minutes, sometimes with an hour in between. "Help is coming. Help is coming." "It's so dark." "Yeah," Keith would agree. "It is." Once, when Lance woke up, he actually remembered what was happening. This instance actually bothered Keith more than when Lance would just lie still in trusting ignorance. It meant he couldn't lie. "Keith!" Lance said, jerking into consciousness this time, right hand flailing out of control. "Keith!" "Right here," Keith answered, pulling Lance's wrist tight against his chest to keep Lance from hitting either of them in the face accidentally. "Don't leave, okay? Not until after." Keith hadn't thought it possible to get colder, but what Lance said chilled him through to his soul. "I'm not leaving. I'm staying with you. Until I'm gone, right?" Keith bit his tongue, his lips pursing together as he realized what Lance was saying. "You're not going to die down here, Lance." "It's okay," Lance said quietly. "I'm sorry." "It's not okay without me." Keith's hand clenched around Lance's wrist. "That's stupid," Keith quipped, unsure what to do with what Lance was saying. How could he really think that? Or did he really think that? He wasn't certain who was talking to him right here. It was so unlike the Lance he was used to that he doubted both versions now. "And you're not gonna die. The team needs you." At least, he hoped not. But it was getting easier to hold Lance still now. His strength was gone. He couldn't stay conscious no matter what Keith did to him to try and keep him that way. He'd been ranting about rain not 10 minutes before this conversation, pleading with someone unknown in Spanish before that. If the castle didn't return for them soon, Keith was beginning to fear that it would be too late for Lance. It might be already if he had truly given up, if he'd reconciled himself to dying. "Blue's gone," Lance said sorrowfully, turning his head away from Keith. "She knows I'm not meant to be a paladin." "But you are!" Keith heard himself say the thought out loud. Lance's eyebrows drew together, but there was no other acknowledgement that he was listening. "You were the first. There would be no Voltron without you." "Keith, you don't have to," Lance muttered. "No, shut up. I shouldn't have to, that's right. But you're lying to yourself, so be quiet and listen. You are Blue's true paladin, you got me? I was living out there in that desert for months, circling around that cave for hours on end. I did tracings of those damn carvings. I spent days and days out there trying to figure out what it all meant. Then you waltz in, put one finger on the wall, and suddenly the whole place lights up like Las Vegas. Because she recognized you immediately. She was waiting for you. If you weren't there, she'd have never woken up. Coran and Allura wouldn't either, and Earth would now be just another planet under Zarkon. I don't know why you would doubt yourself. That makes no sense. Just remember that none of us would be here without you. We need you." "Keith," Lance whispered, his voice so far gone Keith wondered how much he'd actually heard of what he'd just said. "You're Blue's paladin," he said again, fiercely. "She chose you and waited for you. She's waiting for you right now under a pile of rocks. She's all alone out there. So if you can't fight for your own life, then think about that for a minute. She needs you to get her out of here. Are you just going to leave her?" "No," Lance said faintly. "Don't forget it," Keith repeated savagely. But then Lance went limp in his arms again, and Keith had to concentrate hard to figure out if he was still breathing. He was. Keith leaned his head back against the dirt, staring up into the dark, worked up and exhausted at the same time, straining his eyes to see a shooting star, waiting for a wormhole to open overhead and the castle to appear in the nick of time, trying to stretch this wish across the cosmos to draw them back. "Blue," Lance murmured, not waking. Keith twisted his head to look at him, then returned to scanning the sky, trying to reach out to his own lion, who was still out of range. Where had they gone? Maybe they'd been taken, or worse, destroyed. Far off down the canyon, a sudden rumbling echoed. A landslide. Keith barely moved. They were so common down here. This one seemed far enough away that he could ignore it. He wasn't sure what he would do if one happened where they rested. He didn't think he had the strength in him to carry Lance again. They would have to just sit tight, hope for the best, even though everything about that course of action grated against Keith's instinct. He did not do things this way. He didn't just sit tight or wait, which was exactly why he was down here in this situation, watching his teammate's life fading in his lap as he sat completely helpless to stop it. The night stretched on. The sky remained dark. Keith felt stuck in a time loop where the same things rotated incessantly. He would close his eyes a few moments. Lance's uncomfortable stirring would wake him. He would do what he could for him, murmur reassurances, answer the same questions about dark and cold and blue, then try to pinpoint the echoing booms of rock slides elsewhere in the canyon, the ones that seemed to come at regular intervals. Keith stared back the way they had come, wondering what had set off this string of cave-ins. Why were there so many? Why did it sound like they were coming closer? "What's that?" Lance asked, jerking awake, confused. "It's thunder," Keith lied. "A storm's coming." Lance didn't answer. He didn't wake again, if he'd actually been awake to begin with. His breathing shallowed and slowed. His body lay limp and lifeless in Keith's lap. Keith's own extremities felt numb in the cold. Another slide. Even closer this time. Keith felt reality come apart at the seams as he sat there. His body felt detached from him. Nothing felt real, and yet everything hurt at the same time. Lance hadn't moved for a long time now. He no longer muttered in his sleep or cried out. He didn't respond when Keith spoke to him or shook him. It became more and more clear that he probably wasn't going to wake up again. All that they'd gone through, and Keith had failed him anyway. The rumblings of rock slides were closer, louder, pounding in rhythm. Keith could feel the canyon trembling underneath him, then into him as fear sizzled into his half-frozen bloodstream. It was undeniable now. The slides were getting frighteningly close. What should he do? Small rocks and rivers of dirt began rolling down on either side of him as the slides built up on themselves. That was traveling down the fall line, coming for them. "I'm staying with you, Lance," Keith promised, coughing as the dust kicked up around them. He could sort of see it now, the dust cloud that was barreling down the canyon toward them. But this time he couldn't heave Lance onto his shoulders. Survival instinct told him to get up and run, try to scramble up the side, get to higher ground, move out of the way. But he knew he couldn't. He resisted the urge. There was nowhere he could go. The sides of the canyon where he sat with Lance were shifting. The rocks were already breaking loose, banging their way down. Keith maneuvered Lance to the ground, pushing him into the fetal position. Now he couldn't see. He closed his eyes tightly against the fine grains of dirt that whipped all around him. There was nothing but crashing, huge noises of doom. "We're going to be okay," Keith screamed stupidly at his unconscious companion over the noise. He didn't know why he did it. It all seemed so pointless. But he curled over Lance, covering his head with his shoulders and back, bracing himself in a coil over him, tightening up, waiting for the inevitable. A rock bashed into his lower back, not big enough to break bones, but large enough that he bit his lip at the unexpected pain. And more were sure to follow. He bent his head over Lance's head, waiting for it to be over. He felt the shadow of something huge moving over top of him, felt its weight hanging in the air above him. He grabbed onto Lance as tight as he could, squeezing his eyes shut, waiting for whatever was coming to drop and crush them both. "It'll be over soon," he told himself, told his racing heart and panicking brain. Any second now they would be buried beneath tons of rocks and dirt. The air split above him, billows of grit pressing into his back, the aura of what was coming. The ground all around them broke apart with the force of the collapse, and Keith grabbed onto Lance, ricocheted all around them, sharp and impossibly loud. Keith clutched at Lance as the world disappeared, the only real thing left that he cared about. There was a crashing, then a whirring. Keith's equilibrium shattered. He felt as though he were falling into the sky, and at last his mind shut down, and there was nothing but calm blackness.